everyone, this is GareBear.
And this is AlliCat, and you're watching What in the World?
No, seriously, what in the world?
If you guys are asking yourselves that question and watching this thinking about some idiot that you had to deal with on the subway, or the random piece of bureaucracy you had to deal with today, then you probably just want to watch another channel.
Right, because unfortunately for you guys, we are not philosophers.
At least not most of the time.
Instead, we're just two geeks really curious about the way that worlds work in stories. So we're here to take apart the elements of world building, analyzing when they work, when they don't work, and what creators do to create the world of a story.
Right, because let's face it, the plot and characters don't exist in a vacuum. So, without further ado, let's get started with our very first topic, Game of Thrones!
Or the Song of Ice and Fire. For those of you that don't know, the HBO show, the Game of Thrones, is actually based on a book series by George R.R. Martin called The Song of Ice and Fire. If you haven't read it yet, you really should go check it out.
Song of Ice and Fire features an intricate backdrop that enhances and enriches the drama of the narrative. And the series' corresponding show, Game of Thrones, takes all of that and puts it into the visual medium.
And the result is that Westeros and all of its surrounding area is actually just as much a character as the actual characters. It has just as richly defined and it has just as much complexity.
Game of Thrones also has the most Tolkienian universe since, well, Tolkien. So this gives us a lot to cover, but because this is our first video, we can only cover so much, yada yada yada, so we picked our top three
in 3D.
Three points that make the world of Game of Thrones the awesome thing that it is. So, our very first point is politics! Politics! So, let's talk politics.
The first couple seasons revolve around the War of Five Kings, which involves 5 different would-be monarchs raising armies and vying for the Iron Throne, which is supposed to preside over 7 individual kingdoms. The war begins with the death of King Robert Baratheon.
And a crisis of succession follows because someone had to go and open their big mouth to the most evil queen since, well, the evil queen. And you have fallout from that.
And people start to raise armies.
And play both sides of the board.
And on and on and on. At least 4 factions develop, vying for the throne or for separation from the kingdoms.
Not to mention the gathering of their allies and vassals, informants and agents, etc.
Everyone at every level of power has some sort of stake in the conflict or some side that they're playing. You can't really get much more political than that.
Point being, the political system is what makes all of this possible. None of this would be happening if not for a few key choices that Martin had to make concerning the political structure of his world. Not to go all Murica on you, but imagine if the 7 kingdoms were republics, and Westeros was united by a constitution rather than a monarchy.
I think that you'd have medieval House of Cards, sort of.
Even discounting democracy, what if the Targaryen conquest had, instead of semi-unifying these kingdoms, actually dissolved them?
Or what if the fall of the Targaryens actually led to the restoration of the kingdoms as separate entities, returning to the pre-conquest status quo? We're not saying that any of these would be bad stories. Quite the contrary, they'd probably be really interesting, but they wouldn't really be Game of Thrones.
Now, let's just subtract the politics from Game of Thrones for a second. What kind of story would we have then?
The most obvious answer is that it would be a story of humanity preparing for the White Walker threat. We might follow Jon Snow, for instance, as he tries to spread the news of the threat to the areas outside of the North. Mance Rayder would become a sort of Sauron-esque villain, and the major conflict would probably be more about humanity uniting to overcome Mance's armies of wildlings and White Walkers.
And in that case, maybe you could get Daenerys Targaryen to come in with her dragons and just be awesome, and it's like, I am the Khaleesi! Boom! Die! Dracarys! And it'd be awesome. Definitely a different type of story altogether.
It's much less gray, it's much more black and white.
And it's really the gray areas that make Game of Thrones so interesting and well-rounded, both in terms of characters and conflict.
No character is purely good or purely evil. I mean, I think for the book readers out there, we all kind of know the moment where we started kind of feeling bad for Jaime Lannister, who's set up as the villain in the first book.
No conflict is without multiple points of view, and these perspectives are made possible through a political system and a political plot. And it gives Game of Thrones its punch, because the political plot is ripe for
backstabbing!
And espionage! And hoop skirts!
And speaking of death, the world of ice and fire, and here I mean the actual physical reality of the world, is just as likely to kill you as anyone who inhabits it.
Or if not kill you, at least make things a hell of a lot more difficult to accomplish.
Or make you late for things. I mean, if you think about it, the geography could potentially save you from death. But I tend to think it's more likely to kill you from cold, starvation, wild animals, or falling from a great height.
Anyway, the geographical makeup of the world, from the mountains to the deserts to the forests, is a key component in how the story functions.
The difficulties associated with travel, not to mention the cultures that have adapted to fit their geographical constraints, all combine to add in obstacles for our characters to overcome.
The geography of a world determines not only obstacles in travel time, but also weather, climate, flora, fauna, and most importantly, the types of human or humanoid cultures that exist in these surroundings.
In real life, different cultures don't develop in close proximity to one another. You need actual physical distance in order for different communities to sprout. This seems like common sense, but it's actually something that you need to consider when you're building a fantasy world, especially if you want your characters to be journeying from different groups of people in a short period of time.
Speaking of time, years-long summers, years-long winters. This is such a thing that's so crucial that it passes under the radar. It's so integrated into the show that you forget it's a thing. But winter is coming is a prominent motto in Game of Thrones for good reason.
The fact that the seasons in the world of ice and fire last years instead of months is the foundation of a huge conflict in Game of Thrones.
It establishes a time crunch in the very beginning, something to loom in the background while characters, and the viewers, worry about the political intrigues and gruesome battles taking center stage.
When we start Game of Thrones, the world has been lulled into complacency over the course of an unusually long summer, having mostly forgotten the terrible harshness of winter, save for a wise few that know when winter does come, humans must be prepared. Because if you think the world is dangerous now, just wait until those White Walkers come to town. We put the seasons in the geography section because we kind of thought they had to deal with the physical nature of the setting.
But the summers and their length could just as easily be caused by
magic!
Magic in the world of Ice and Fire is bundled with various religions, which are diversified by location.
Now, usually one wouldn't equate religion and magic, since in most works of fiction, they're very distinct, separate things, and they're often at odds with one another. Martin's world is interesting because they actually are intrinsically linked instead.
In that magic is virtually impossible without some kind of religion attached to it, and it's usually weaponized when used intentionally.
It's probably most obvious with Melisandre, whose god of light R'hllor allows her to perform feats like resist poison,
or have shadow babies. Between creepy sex magic, creepy revival magic, creepy duplication magic, creepy disguise magic, it's pretty clear that magic in this world is not to be entered into lightly.
Not only do religions seem to confer some magical attributes on their most devoted followers, they actively shape the cultures which they predominate, just as real-life religions do. You have your larger religions, like the Faith of the Seven and the Cult of R'hllor, and then you have your more or less local belief systems.
The world of Ice and Fire seems to be home to several dozen faiths that all have unique gods and rituals associated with them. Dothraki have their horse gods, the Northerners have their old gods.
The White Walkers have whatever they have. Interesting fact, though. The religions of Westeros are rarely the cause of the conflict in and of themselves. Despite their differences, the story's conflict isn't about a war of churches or a crusade. However, the fact that these religions are all tied in with magic means that they do inadvertently cause conflict, raise the stakes of a conflict, or else provide character development.
Because religion is inherently magically powerful, it does play a part in the power of the factions that chooses to subscribe to it. This, of course, gives certain advantages, sometimes even serving as a bit of a game changer. Which, I guess that's why it's important to talk about things like world building in general, because as much as you fall in love with the characters and the plot of a given novel, TV show, or video game, it's so important to have a world that supports it. You get so much more out of it, because it informs the characters and the plot, and it makes them what they are, or at least provides the catalyst for the things that actually suck you in.
And for these 3 points of Game of Thrones, they actually end up doing both, and that makes the world that much more appealing.
Except, you know, for the part that you wouldn't want to actually live in Westeros. Because shit gets real bloody real fast.
Truth. And that is all the time we have for this video.
If you got questions about Game of Thrones and world building, shoot us a comment.
And remember to subscribe.
Or if you're not into the whole subscribing thing, follow us on social media, post it up, somewhere around here so that you can see what in the world we're gonna talk about next. Until then, stay curious.
And stay creative!